Hi, third graders, it's Miss Ashby. I'm here today to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, equivalent fractions. So, the reason that equivalent fractions is one of my favorite topics to talk about is because equivalent fractions is taking what we have and cutting it into more pieces and being able to share it with more people. Today I'm going to teach you a strategy of how to find equivalent fractions on a number line. Remember, as a mathematician, we teach you lots of different strategies so that you can find the one that works the best for you. If today I start to talk about finding equivalent fractions on a number line and you feel like that doesn't click with you as a mathematician, remember that that's okay. You can continue to draw a model to find an equivalent fraction. You can continue to use the cross multiplication strategy to find equivalent fractions, or maybe you even use fraction strips to help you. If today we start talking about equivalent fractions and you think, I just really don't understand equivalent fractions at all, remember that that's also okay. We have many opportunities as mathematicians and as students to continue to learn and understand equivalent fractions. So if today you feel like it still doesn't click with you, it still doesn't make sense, remember that that's also okay. I first wanted to talk a little bit about what an equivalent fraction really is. Another reason why I like equivalent fractions is because I get to use food as a model or as an example for equivalent fractions. So equivalent fractions are two fractions that have different numerators and denominators, but the same value. Here I have a couple examples of some pizzas. Each of these pizzas have been cut into different number of slices. The number of slices is my denominator, or that number on bottom. This first pizza has been cut into two slices. One out of two of those slices is filled with cheese and pepperoni, the good stuff. Here in the next pizza, or the next example, that slice has been cut into more pieces. I still have the same value or the same amount of pizza covered with cheese and covered with pepperoni, but now I have more slices. You'll notice that the more slices I get, the smaller the pizzas, or the smaller the pieces become. So here I have one out of two slices covered in cheese and pepperoni. Here I have 2 out of 4 slices covered with cheese and pepperoni. The value is the same. The slices are just smaller, and now I have more pieces. Here, that pizza has been cut up into more slices. Each of those fourths has been cut in half again to create a total of 8 slices. That's my denominator. That's the number on the bottom. I see that I still have the same value. It's still half of the pizza covered in cheese and pepperoni. But now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 slices, and those pieces are smaller. Those are all equivalent fractions. I can see with this picture, with this model, this delicious model, how the pieces become smaller the more I start to cut into them, the more I take each of those pieces and cut them in half. Before we start to talk about finding equivalent fractions using a number line, I just kind of wanted to review with you what a number line is. A number line represents the value between numbers. We use it a lot to help us solve math problems. So this number line is representing the value of 0 and 2. Using this number line, I can see that the value between 0 and 2 would be 1, 2. Number lines can also be used to represent fractions. When I use a number line to represent a fraction, I'm actually taking my whole and I'm cutting it up into more pieces. Before we get started talking about some of those things, I like to use music and I like to use videos to help me understand concepts. So I found a video for you that's a little bit about how to find fractions on a number line.
Asked my friend if she could help me find where to write 1/2 on the number line. She said,
first draw a line with 2 arrows.
Then she sang a song. Here's how it goes. 0 to 1 is the whole that we split apart. The denominator tells us into how many parts. Make a line that starts from 0 to the first mark. And 1/2 is what you'll find when you get that far. My stuffed animal can't talk, but I thought I heard.
Hey Ben, on the number line, where's 1/3?
I said first draw a line with 2 arrows. And hey, I know a cool tune. Here's Here's how it goes. 0 to 1 is the whole that we split apart. The denominator tells us into how many parts. Make a line that starts from 0 to the first mark. And 1/3 is what you'll find when you get that far. Then I texted my friend, what's to be done when the numerator isn't 1? She said,
Let's try to find 5/9 on the number line in like no time. Simply partition 9 parts from 0 to 1. Starting from 0, count 5, and at 5 nines we arrive.
0 to 1 is the whole that we split apart. The denominator tells us into how many parts. Make a line that starts from 0 to the 5th mark. And 5 nines is what you'll find when you get that far. Let's use the number line to describe this pie. First, count the total pieces. There are 5. 5's the denominator, all the parts. So 5 goes underneath the fraction bar. This number line goes from 0 to 2, but the fraction's less than 1, so here's what to do. Make 5 equal spaces from 0 to 1. Now the final step before we're done. The numerator is the one piece that's mine. After the first space, I'll write 1/5 of the line. Just remember this one tip in your minds. Always count the spaces, never the lines. 0 to 1 is the whole that we split apart. The denominator tells us into how many parts. Make a line that starts from 0 to the first mark. And 1/5 is what you'll find when you get that far. When you get that far, yeah. When you get that far, yeah.
My favorite part of that video, my favorite tip that I got from it, is thinking about counting the parts and not counting the number of lines that are created when you're working with fractions on a number line. So when I'm working with fractions on a number line, I'm taking a whole and I'm splitting it up into more parts. When I look at this number line, I see that I have one line down the middle, but really it's been split up into 1, 2, equal parts. Now I can use each of those parts and write a fraction that would represent the parts that I have. Here I have 0 out of 2 parts, here I have 1 out of 2 parts, and here I have 2 out of 2 parts, or a whole. Here's another example of what that could possibly look like. So remember, we're not counting the lines, we're counting the parts that were created between the whole of 0 and 1. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 equal parts. Now I can use fractions to represent each of those parts. 0 out of 4 parts, 1 out of 4 parts, 2 out of 4 parts, 3 out of 4 parts, 4 out of 4 parts, or a whole. Now I do want to show you how we can use that number line to find equivalent fractions. So finding equivalent fractions on a number line, we use them by taking a look at the parts that we have and looking for the fractions that fall on the same line. Take a look at the first number line, at this number line on top. I see that this number line from 0 to 1 has been cut up into 1, 2 equal pieces. Now I can use fractions to name each of those parts. Here I have 0 out of 2 parts, 1 out of 2 parts, and 2 out of 2 parts, or a whole. Just like when we looked at that pizza, to find an equivalent fraction, we take each of our parts and we cut them into more pieces. The fractions that are equivalent on a number line are the ones that fall on the same spot. So here when I take a look at the number line below it, I see that this number line has also been split up from 0 to 1, but I see that it's been split up into more pieces. The value doesn't change those pieces, it just changes the size of them. So here, this number line has been split up into 1, 2, 3, 4 equal pieces. Now I can use fractions to represent each of those lines or each of those marks. This would be 0 out of 4 parts, 1 out of 4 parts, 2 out of 4 parts, 3 out of 4 parts, 4 out of 4 parts, or a whole. When I'm looking to find a fraction that's equivalent, I look for the fractions that fall on the same line. I see that a half lines up with 2/4. those fractions would be equivalent. They have the same value. 2/4 just has more pieces and smaller pieces as well. So here is how we go to find equivalent fractions on a number line. As a mathematician, if I was looking to find a fraction that's equivalent to 1/3, what I would have to do is I'd have to begin by creating my number line. If I'm trying to represent the fraction 1/3, I take a look at the denominator. That's how many pieces, that's how many parts I need to have on my number line. I'm going to take my number line and split it up into 3 equal parts. 1, 2, 3. Now I can label each of those pieces. 0 out of 3, 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3, 3 out of 3, or a whole. If I want to find a fraction that's equivalent to it, just like with that pizza, I need to take each part and split each part in half. Then I need to label or name each of those parts and then look for the fractions that line up. Those are my fractions that are equivalent. So this number line has already taken the thirds and split them up in half. Each of those fractions is already named. 0 out of 6, 1 out of 6, 2 out of 6, 3 out of 6, 4 out of 6, 5 out of 6, and then 6 out of 6 are a whole. The fractions that line up or match are the ones that are equivalent. So when I take a look at this number line, and if I'm looking for a fraction that's equivalent to 1/3, I'm looking for the fraction that lines up with it. Here I see that 2/6 lines up with the third. They have the same value. 2/6 just has more pieces and smaller pieces. When I take a look at 1/6, I see that there's not a third that lines up with it, which means that there's not a third that's equivalent to it. When I take a look at 4/6, I see that 4/6 lines up with 2/3. They have the same value, they cover the same amount of space. 2/3 just has bigger pieces. 4/6 has smaller pieces. Same with 6 out of 6 and 3 out of 3, or a whole. Those fractions are equivalent. They line up. They cover the same value. The thirds just has bigger pieces than the sixth. Let's take a look at another example. So as a mathematician, if I were looking to find a fraction equivalent to 1/4, I would begin by creating my number line. I would take my number line and I would split it up into 4 equal parts because that's what my denominator is. That's how many pieces I need. This number line has already been split up into 4 equal parts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of those parts has already been labeled. 0 out of 4, 1 out of 4, 2 out of 4, 3 out of 4, and then 4 out of 4, or a whole. If I want to find a fraction that's equivalent to 1/4, I'm going to take each of these parts and I'm going to split them each in half, just like this number line below already has. Then I need to take each of those parts and name the fraction that matches up with it. The fractions that line up are equivalent. So here the number line below has already taken each fourth and cut each of those pieces in half. I have 0/8, 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, 8/8, or a whole. Now I'm looking for the fractions that line up because they have the same value. When I look at 1/4, I see that 2/8 lines up with it. They cover the same amount of space, they have the same value. 2/8 just has smaller pieces. 1/4 has one piece, but it's much bigger than the eights. Same thing with 4/8 and 2/4. They cover the same amount of space on the number line. 4/8 just has smaller pieces than 2/4. 6/8 and 3/4 also line up. They have the same value, just different size pieces. 4/4 and 8 out of 8 also are equivalent fractions. They both equal the fraction a whole. I wanted to show you a little bit what your practice will look like once you go to do this independently. So on Google Classroom, you will find your assignment. It's called Equivalent Fractions on a Number Line Practice. So the first thing that you'll see is a slide that says drag the fraction to the correct box. Your job as a mathematician is to take these green boxes and line them up with the correct fraction. What we talked about in our lesson is that a fraction on a number line, we are looking at the number of parts that are created, not the number of lines. So as a mathematician, I would need to count the number of spaces that I have, the number of parts that I have, not the number of lines. This fraction has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 equal parts. As a mathematician, I would then begin by counting up each of those lines by 6 because that's how many parts I have. So I know that my very first one has to be 0 out of 6 parts. Then I continue to count up by 6 until I get to my whole. So 0 out of 6, 1/6, 2/6. I'm not going to continue because I think that you'll know exactly what to do next. The next couple of slides are all about using those number lines to find equivalent fractions. As a mathematician, I know that the lines on those number lines, the ones that line up or match up, are fractions that are equivalent. So here I'm looking for the fraction that would be equivalent to 2/4 and the fraction that would be equivalent to 1/4. First, I need to find the fraction 2/4 and then look to see which one lines up with it. Same thing with 1/4. You'll continue that practice a couple more times on your own. Third graders, I really enjoyed talking about equivalent fractions today. I hope you enjoy that practice, and I hope to see you soon. Have a great day.